In the beginning, before the world knew sorrow, there was a garden. It was not like the gardens we tend today, with their carefully marked rows and their need for constant care. This was a garden that grew from the hand of God Himself, a place where every tree bore fruit in its season, where water flowed without effort, and where the air itself seemed to hum with peaceful purpose. Before we enter this story together, let me invite you to settle in. This is a space for rest, for quiet listening. Let the words wash over you gently. There is nothing here you need to hold on to tightly. Simply breathe and let the story unfold. The garden had a name. It was called Eden, which means delight. It was placed in the east, in a land that would one day be known by many names, but which in those days was simply the place where heaven and earth seemed to touch. There were rivers there, 4 of them branching out from a single source, carrying life to all the land. The water was clear and cold, and it moved with a gentle sound, the kind that invites rest rather than demands attention. Along the banks of these rivers grew trees of every kind, their leaves full and green, their branches heavy with fruit. In the center of this garden, God had placed 2 trees that were unlike all the others. One was called the tree of life. Its fruit, if eaten, would sustain life forever. The other was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this tree, God had said, was not to be eaten from. In this garden lived the first man and the first woman. Their names were Adam and Eve, and they had been made by God's own hand, formed from the dust of the earth and the breath of heaven. They did not know shame. They did not know fear. They walked in the cool of the day with God Himself, and they tended the garden as those who serve without burden. The work they did was not toil, it was participation. They pruned and planted, they named the animals, they walked among the trees and gathered what grew freely. There was order in Eden, the natural rhythm of things made well. Adam and Eve knew only one boundary in all the garden. They could eat of any tree they wished, except one. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood in the center of the garden, and God had spoken clearly about it. On the day they ate from that tree, He had said, they would surely die. It was a simple instruction. 1 tree among thousands, 1 limit in a world of abundance. For a time, this was enough. But into this garden came another voice. The creature who spoke was a serpent. In those days, before the curse, the serpent moved differently than it does now. It did not crawl on its belly through the dust. It was, perhaps, more beautiful than we can imagine. Crafty, the scripture says. Clever. And it had watched the man and woman as they moved through the garden. One day, when the woman was near the center of the garden, near the place where the 2 great trees grew, the serpent spoke to her. Its voice was not harsh. It did not shout or accuse. It simply asked a question, the way one might begin a conversation on a quiet afternoon. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? It was a small distortion, a subtle twisting of what God had actually said. God had given them freedom to eat from every tree but one. The serpent made it sound as though God had forbidden them all. Eve Eve answered carefully. She had heard God's instruction, and she knew the truth. "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden," she said, "but God did say, 'You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.'" She had added something. God had not said they could not touch it, only that they should not eat. It was a small addition, but it revealed something, perhaps a fear, perhaps a misunderstanding. She saw the command as more restrictive than it was. The serpent moved closer. "You will not surely die," it said. And now its voice carried a new tone, not questioning, but certain, confident. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." There it was, the lie wrapped in truth. It was true that eating the fruit would open their eyes. It was true that they would come to know good and evil. But the serpent painted this as something desirable, something God was withholding. It suggested that God was keeping them small, keeping them from their full potential. The woman looked at the tree. She had walked past it many times before. She had seen its leaves, had perhaps smelled its fruit on the wind, but she had never looked at it this way. Now, with the serpent's words in her mind, she saw it differently. The fruit was pleasing to the eye. It looked ripe and full, the kind of fruit that promises satisfaction. She saw that it was good for food. There was nothing poisonous in its appearance, nothing to warn her away. And she considered what the serpent had said, that it was desirable for gaining wisdom. She reached out her hand. The fruit came away easily from the branch. It was cool in her palm, smooth-skinned and perfect. She lifted it to her mouth and she ate. The text does not tell us what it tasted like. We do not know if it was sweet or tart, if it was satisfying or disappointing. We know only that she ate it, and that the world in that moment changed. She turned to her husband, who was with her. Adam was there. He was not far away, unaware of what was happening. He was with her, and he said nothing. He did not object. He did not remind her of God's command. When she offered him the fruit, he took it, and he ate. For a moment, perhaps, there was silence in the garden. And then their eyes were opened. The scripture says their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked. They had always been naked. They had walked in the garden without clothing, without shame, without any sense that their bodies were something to hide. But now, suddenly, they saw themselves differently. They saw their vulnerability. They saw their exposure. And for the first time, they felt shame. Quickly, they moved among the trees, pulling down fig leaves and weaving them together, fashioning coverings for themselves. The work was clumsy, improvised. The leaves were rough and inadequate, but it was all they could think to do. And then they heard the sound they had heard many times before. It was the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. In that part of the world, the cool of the day likely meant the evening, when the heat of the afternoon had passed and a gentle breeze moved through the trees. It was the time of rest, the time when work ceased and conversation began. God had walked with them in this way before, and it had always been a time of peace, But now, when they heard the sound of his approach, they were afraid. They hid themselves among the trees. They hid from God in the garden he had made, among the trees he had planted. They thought, somehow, that they could conceal themselves from the one who had formed them, who knew every part of them, who had breathed life into their lungs. But fear does not think clearly. They crouched behind the foliage and held their breath, hoping he would pass by. He did not. God called out to the man. His voice moved through the garden, gentle but undeniable. "Where are you?" It was not that God did not know where Adam was. It was an invitation, an opportunity, a chance to step out from hiding and speak the truth. Adam answered from among the trees. "I heard you in the garden," he said, "and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." There is something achingly human in those words. I was afraid. I was naked. I hid. It is the simplest confession, and yet it contains everything: the fear, the shame, the desperate attempt to cover what has been exposed. God's response was another question. "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The question was direct, but it was not cruel. It was the kind of question a father asks, knowing the answer, giving a child the chance to confess freely. Adam spoke again, but instead of confessing, he shifted the blame. "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." There is a double accusation in these words. Not only is the woman blamed, but God himself. "The woman you put here with me," as if to say, "This is your fault, God, for giving her to me." It is the first recorded instance of a human being refusing responsibility. God turned to the woman. "What is this you have done?" Eve's answer mirrored her husband's. "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." She too shifted blame. "The serpent, not me. I was deceived." And in a sense it was true. She had been deceived. The serpent had lied to her, but the lie had found fertile ground because she had chosen to listen, had chosen to doubt, had chosen to reach out her hand. There was silence in the garden again. And then God spoke judgment. He began with the serpent. The serpent had spoken the lie, and so the serpent would bear the first curse. God said that it would crawl on its belly and eat dust all the days of its life. More than this, there would be enmity, deep, lasting hostility between the serpent and the woman, and between the serpent's offspring and hers. And then came a promise, hidden within the curse. The woman's offspring, God said, would crush the serpent's head, though the serpent would strike his heel. It was a strange and cryptic statement, but it carried hope. In the midst of judgment, there was the hint of something greater to come. A child born of woman who would one day undo the serpent's work. It would be a costly victory. The serpent would wound him, but it would be a victory nonetheless. Then God turned to the woman. He did not curse her, but he described the consequences of what had been done. She would experience pain in childbearing, pain that had not existed before, and her relationship with her husband would be marked by struggle. A desire for him that would be met with his rule over her. What had been harmony would now carry the weight of brokenness. Finally, God spoke to Adam. Because Adam had listened to his wife and eaten from the tree, the ground itself would be cursed. The earth that had produced freely would now resist him. Thorns and thistles would grow among the crops. Work, which had been joyful participation, would now be toil. He would eat by the sweat of his brow, laboring all his days until he returned to the ground from which he was taken. For dust you are, God said, and to dust you will return. It was a sobering reminder. Adam had been formed from the earth, and without access to the tree of life, he would one day return to it. Death, which had only been a distant warning, was now a certainty. But even in this moment of judgment, there was mercy. God made garments of skin for Adam and Eve, and he clothed them. The fig leaves they had woven for themselves were not enough. They were flimsy, temporary, inadequate. So God himself provided covering for them, and the covering was made of skin, which means that an animal gave its life. It was the first death in creation, and it was to cover the shame of those who had sinned. It was an act of kindness in the midst of consequence, but they could not stay in the garden. God said that the man had now become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now, lest he reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever in his broken state, he must be sent away. So God banished them from the Garden of Eden. The word banish feels harsh to our ears. It sounds like anger, like punishment. But perhaps it was protection. Perhaps it was mercy to keep them from eating of the tree of life and being locked forever in their fallenness. Unable to die. Unable to escape the consequences of their choice. Adam and Eve walked out through the entrance to the garden. Behind them, God placed cherubim, mighty angelic beings, and a flaming sword that flashed back and forth, guarding the way to the tree of life. The garden remained. The tree of life remained, but the path to it was closed. Adam and Eve went out into a world that was the same and yet entirely different. The sun still rose, the rivers still flowed, but now there were thorns among the flowers. Now there was sweat on the brow. Now there was fear in the heart. They would have children. They would build and plant and live out their days. But every day would carry the weight of that first choice, that first reaching, that first turning away. And yet, woven through the story, hidden in the judgment, was the thread of hope. The serpent had not won, though it seemed he had. God had spoken of a seed, a child, who would come. The battle was not over. The story was not finished. In the ancient world, gardens were sacred spaces. They were places of order carved out of the wilderness, places where water flowed and life flourished. Kings built gardens to demonstrate their power and their care. Eden was the ultimate garden, the place where God walked with humanity, where his presence was near and his voice was clear. To be cast out of the garden was not just to lose a location. It was to lose the immediate presence of God. It was to step into distance, into separation. But even in that separation, God did not abandon them. He clothed them. He promised a future Redeemer. He allowed them to live, to bear children, to carry on. The story of the fall is the story of a choice, a real choice with real consequences. God had given Adam and Eve freedom, true freedom, and they used it to reach for something he had told them would bring death. He did not lie. death came. Not instantly, not in the moment they ate the fruit, but slowly, inevitably, working its way through creation like a shadow spreading across the ground. They would die physically, eventually, but something died in them immediately. The innocence, the unbroken communion, the ease of relationship with God. And yet, in the midst of this, there was still grace. They were not struck down. They were not obliterated. They were sent out, but they were sent out clothed, and they were sent out with a promise. The serpent had promised that eating the fruit would make them like God. In a sense, it did. They came to know good and evil, but not in the way God knows. God knows good and evil from the outside, with perfect wisdom and perfect justice. Adam and Eve came to know them from the inside, through experience, through shame, through the fracturing of their own hearts. They became like God in knowledge, but more distant from Him in intimacy. The eastern sky beyond Eden would have been vast. The land stretched out before them, unmarked and wild. They would have to learn to survive in ways they had not needed to before. They would learn hunger and exhaustion. They would learn the ache of regret, but they would also learn resilience. They would learn hope. They would learn to long for restoration. The flaming sword behind them turned this way and that, guarding the way to the tree of life. It was not there to threaten them. It was there to keep the way closed until the appointed time. Because one day, in a future they could not yet see, the way would be opened again. One day, a descendant of the woman would come, born in humility, living in obedience where they had disobeyed, dying the death they deserved, and rising to offer them the life they had lost. One day, there would be another tree. Not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but a tree shaped like a cross, on which the promised seed would hang and crush the serpent's head, even as his own heel was bruised. One day, there would be another garden, a garden tomb, empty, because death could not hold the one who conquered it. And one day, in the end of all things, there would be a new Eden, a city and a garden together, where the tree of life would grow beside a river, and its leaves would be for the healing of the nations, and there would be no more curse, no more separation, no more shame. God would dwell with His people again, and they would see His face. But that was far away, in a future hidden from Adam and Eve as they took their first steps into the world outside the garden. For now, there was simply the long road ahead, the sun setting behind them. The unknown stretched out before them. They walked together, the man and the woman, into the twilight. And somewhere, in the mystery of God's heart, the plan of redemption was already in motion. The story of the fall is a story of beginnings and endings. It is the beginning of sorrow, but not the end of hope. It is the beginning of separation, but not the abandonment of love. It is the beginning of a long journey home. And so, the first humans stepped out of paradise, carrying with them the memory of what was and the faint, persistent hope of what might one day be again. The garden remained behind them, glowing faintly in the gathering dusk, guarded and waiting. They did not know how long the wait would be. They did not know the full scope of God's plan, but they had His promise, and they had each other. And for tonight, as we close this story, that is enough. There will be more to tell. There will be Cain and Abel, the flood and the ark, the patriarchs and the prophets, the exile and the return. There will be centuries of waiting, of longing, of looking for the promised seed. But all of that is for another night. Tonight, we rest in the knowledge that even in the fall, God did not let go. He walked with them to the edge of the garden. He clothed them with his own hands. He spoke a promise over them, a promise that would echo through the generations. And when at last the fullness of time came, he would send his son, born of a woman, born under the law, born to redeem those who were under the curse, to bring them and us home. Until that day, we walk as Adam and Eve walked, in a world marked by beauty and brokenness, in a story that is not yet finished. But we walk with hope. We walk toward the morning. We walk toward the promise. And tonight, as you close your eyes, may you rest in this, that the God who walked in the garden still walks with his people, that the God who clothed our first parents still covers us with grace, that the God who promised a Redeemer has kept his word. The garden is behind us, but the tree of life awaits, and the way will be opened. Rest now. The story continues, but for tonight, it is enough to know that we are held. We are loved. We are not alone. Sleep well.